The floorboards under the archives of the St. Petersburg Municipal Registry do not just creak, they groan under the weight of a silence that has been meticulously curated for over a century. I found myself there, not looking for a name, but for a void. I was looking for the space where a name should have been. It started with a single baptismal record from 1884, found in a damp basement in what was once a thriving district of the old empire. The ink was iron gall biting into the vellum, but the entry was peculiar. It listed a birth, a weight, and a location, yet the space for the surname was struck through with a heavy, deliberate line of black ink. Not a mistake, not a smudge, a deletion. Ask yourself why a state apparatus so obsessed with the granular details of its citizenry would choose to enwrite a child. This was not an isolated clerical error. It was the first stitch in a tapestry of institutional erasure that spans continents and defies the conventional timeline of our shared history. We are taught that history is a ledger of presence, a recording of who was where and when they died. But what if history is actually a map of absences? What if the most important figures in our lineage are the ones who were never allowed to exist on paper? I began to pull at that stitch, and the entire fabric of the late 19th century started to unravel. I found more records. In Prague, in Vienna, in the dusty annexes of San Francisco's pre-earthquake filings, thousands of entries where the name should be, but instead there is only a gap. These are the children born into a geography that no longer exists on any modern map. They were born in a shadow realm our textbooks call Tartaria, a term dismissed by modern academics as a mere cartographic shorthand for a vast, empty wilderness. But empty wildernesses do not produce children who require systematic, bureaucratic deletion. Empty wildernesses do not leave behind the skeletal remains of star forts and red brick cathedrals that defy the primitive tools of the era. I stood before the ruins of a thermal power station in the outskirts of a city that officially didn't exist until the mid-1900s, yet its foundations are laid with a precision that suggests a mastery of load distribution far beyond the capabilities of the supposed settlers. The brickwork is fused, not mortared. It speaks of a high thermal process, a technology lost to the fires of the Great Reset. I touched the cold stone and felt the vibration of a stolen frequency. These children, these nameless spectres of the old world, were the last witnesses to a global civilization that harnessed the atmospheric medium itself. They were the heirs to a world of free energy and wireless transmission, a world that was forcibly disconnected and then burned to the ground. Look at the photographs from the 1850s. Look at the mud-flooded streets of cities like Chicago and Moscow. Notice the people. They look like refugees in their own homes. They wear oversized clothes. They occupy buildings they clearly did not build, structures with 20-foot ceilings and intricate mouldings that serve no aesthetic purpose but function as resonant chambers. They are the inheritors of a ghost civilization. The children I am searching for were the last generation born before the curtain fell. They were the ones who saw the sky change. They were the ones who remembered the light that didn't come from a wire. And because they remembered, they had to be erased. Not killed, perhaps, though the foundling hospitals of the era tell a grimmer story, but unpersoned, stripped of their lineage, re-educated in the orphan trains that crisscross the American West, or the Siberian steppes, or the Australian outback. The pattern is identical. The institutional gatekeeping is absolute. We are told these were charitable efforts to save the displaced. Ask yourself, displaced from where? If the land was empty, where did the orphans come from? The scale of the discrepancy is staggering. When you begin to calculate the population growth of the 19th century against the documented birth rates, the math fails. There are millions of souls missing from the census, yet the cities are full. There are ghost populations appearing in the record, only to vanish a decade later. This is the hallmark of a controlled demolition of history. The architects of our current reality did not just build new cities. They inhabited the ruins of the old ones and claimed them as their own. They took the grand libraries of Tartaria and turned them into ash, saving only the volumes that served the new narrative. They took the children of the masters and turned them into the servants of the new age. I tracked one such child, or the ghost of one, through a series of hospital ledgers in London. He was referred to only as Subject 1042. His physiological data was anomalous. Bone density 30% higher than the average, a resting heart rate that suggested a different atmospheric pressure than the one we breathe today. He was a relic of a high-pressure, high-oxygen world, a world where the giants of myth were simply the humans of yesterday. And then he was gone. The ledger ends mid-sentence. No death certificate, no burial plot, just a void. This is the somber reality of our investigation. We are not just looking for facts. We are looking for the people the facts were designed to hide. We are urban explorers of the soul, navigating the subterranean tunnels of a buried timeline. Consider the architecture of the world's fairs. We are told they were temporary structures of plaster and lath, built in months and torn down in weeks. But look at the photographs. Look at the massive domes and the intricate masonry. These were not temporary pavilions. They were the recovered capitals of the previous epoch, repurposed for a final decadent display before their deliberate destruction. The children born in these cities, in the shadow of these white cathedrals, were the last to know the truth. They saw the temporary palaces being dynamited. They saw the statues being melted down. They were told it was progress. They were told that the world they saw with their own eyes was a dream. Imagine the psychological toll of such a gaslighting. To live in a city of marble and be told it is made of mud. To remember a father who spoke of the great Khanate and be told that your father never existed. This is not just history, this is trauma. It is a collective amnesia imposed by a ruling class that fears the architecture of the past. They fear the load distribution of truth. They fear that if we ever realize who we are, their fragile grip on the present will shatter like the glass of the Crystal Palace. The erasure is not merely a matter of missing names. It is a fundamental reconfiguration of the human record. In the archives of the Smithsonian and the British Museum, there are crates that have not been opened in a century. I have seen the manifests. They list items that defy the Darwinian timeline. They list artifacts from the Tartarian interior that show a level of metallurgical sophistication that shouldn't have existed until the mid-20th century. And alongside these artifacts, they list the remains of non-standard juveniles. Not standard because they did not fit the mould, because their very existence challenged the mandate of the new rulers. What if the Great Fire of every major city between 1850 and 1910 was not an accident? What if they were tactical strikes designed to burn the records and the witnesses? The Great Fire of Chicago, the Great Fire of London, the Great Fire of San Francisco, each one followed by a rapid rebuilding in a sterile modern style, each one resulting in the unfortunate loss of the municipal archives. It is a clean slate, a tabula rasa for the New World Order, and the children, they were moved, they were renamed, they were folded into the burgeoning industrial machine, their pasts replaced with the manufactured toil of the coal mine and the textile mill. I found a photograph in a private collection in Tallinn. It shows a group of children standing in front of a massive, ornate doorway that seems built for a race of men 10 feet tall. The children are dressed in rags, but their faces carry an expression of profound, weary understanding. They aren't looking at the camera. They are looking through it. It's as if they knew we would be here over 100 years later, trying to piece together the fragments of their lives. They are the silent witnesses to the transition. They are the bridges between the golden age of Tartaria and the iron age of the modern state. And the state knows it. That is why the search for Tartaria is met with such fierce academic derision. To suggest that a global, advanced civilization existed only 2 centuries ago is to suggest that everything we know about our progress is a lie. It is to suggest that we are not ascending toward a peak, but are living in the trough of a great decline. The skepticism of authority is not just a posture, it is a necessity for survival in a world built on institutional gatekeeping. If they lied about the buildings, if they lied about the energy, what else did they lie about? They lied about the lineage. They lied about the very blood in our veins. I've begun to suspect that the orphan trains were not about finding homes for the homeless, but about redistributing the genetic heritage of the old world. If you take the children of the elite of the previous civilization and scatter them among the working class of the new one, you effectively neutralize the threat of a restoration. You create a world of people who feel a strange, haunting nostalgia for a place they've never been. You create a world of seekers who feel in their very marrow that something is missing. Not this life, not this history, something else. We are the descendants of the erased. We are the grandchildren of the children who never appeared in the records. Our DNA is the only archive they couldn't fully burn, though they are certainly trying to rewrite that now as well. The somber truth is that the investigation may never reach a tidy conclusion. The deeper you go, the more the shadows stretch. Every door you open leads to a hallway with 10 more, all locked, all guarded by the same institutional silence. In the basement of a decommissioned monastery in the Ural Mountains, I found a series of ledgers that had escaped the purges. They were written in a script that is a hybrid of Cyrillic and something much older, something that resembles the Voynich manuscript in its flowing, organic complexity. These were the life books of a local community. They didn't just record births, they recorded resonances. They believed that every child was born with a specific harmonic frequency that tied them to the Earth's magnetic field. When a child was born, they were tuned to the local star fort, a structure that acted as a massive capacitor for atmospheric energy. This wasn't mysticism, it was a technical reality. The load distribution of the star forts wasn't just for defense, it was for the distribution of vitality. And the children born in Tartaria were the beneficiaries of this system. They were healthier, more intelligent, and lived longer than we do today. But when the forts were deactivated, when the heavens were closed, as one ledger put it, the children began to wither. The records show a sudden spike in mortality, followed by a series of forced relocations. The tuned generation was harvested. Ask yourself why the history of the 1800s is so focused on war. Every decade has its great conflict. The Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War. What if these weren't political struggles, but a global cleanup operation? A way to use the disposable populations of the New World to grind the remnants of the old world into the dust, a way to justify the destruction of the old cities and the silencing of the old families. The soldiers were the janitors of the reset, and the children were the collateral damage, or the ultimate prize. I've spoken to researchers who have found evidence of re-education camps as early as the 1840s, hidden under the guise of boarding schools and asylums, places where the children of Tartaria were taught to forget their language, forget their parents, and forget the light. It is a chilling thought that the foundation of our modern educational system is built on the ruins of a massive global brainwashing campaign. The patterns are there if you have the eyes to see them. Look at the mud flood evidence in your own city. Look at the windows that sink into the ground. Look at the doors that have been turned into windows. This is the physical evidence of the cataclysm that ended the Tartarian age. But the children are the human evidence. They are the ghosts in the machine. They are the names struck through in the ledger. They are the reason I can't sleep at night. Because once you see the void, you can't unsee it. You realize that you are standing on a graveyard of a civilization that was more beautiful, more advanced, and more human than the one we have now. And you realize that the people who erased it are still in charge. They are the ones who write the textbooks. They are the ones who manage the archives. They are the ones who tell you that questioning the narrative is fringe or conspiratorial. But I ask you, what is more conspiratorial than a history that leaves out millions of people? What is more fringe than a reality that denies the evidence of its own eyes? The investigation continues, not because I expect to find a smoking gun, but because the silence is too loud to ignore. We are the children of the void, and it is time we started asking why. What if the records didn't fail? What if they were perfected? What if the absence of the children is the ultimate proof of their importance? The loop remains open. The mystery remains unsolved, but the feeling of forbidden knowledge persists, a cold wind blowing through the cracks of a crumbling history. Not this story. Not that story. Something else entirely. Something hidden in the blood. Something waiting to be remembered. The architecture of the Great Reset was not merely one of stone and mortar, but one of biological and psychological restructuring. I found a collection of floor plans for the so-called state hospitals of the mid-19th century, buildings that followed a rigid, radiating pattern known as the Kirkbride Plan. On the surface, they were touted as triumphs of moral treatment, but look closer at the load distribution. The walls were lead-lined. The basements contained massive copper coils that had no place in a medical facility. These were not hospitals. They were dampening fields. They were designed to neutralize the atmospheric resonance that the children of Tartaria naturally carried. Ask yourself why every major city in the Western world suddenly needed asylums for thousands of melancholy orphans at the exact same moment. It was an extraction process. They were filtering the population, identifying those who still held the harmonic memory of the old world and isolating them. The technical term used in the internal memos of the Board of Charities was the unassimilated element, not patients, not children, elements, as if they were chemical compounds to be broken down and reconstituted into something useful for the new industrial state. The institutional gatekeeping of this era was so absolute that even the census takers were instructed to categorize these children as of unknown origin or foundlings of the state. The orphan trains, those celebrated vessels of westward expansion, were the logistics of a mass migration of the dispossessed. Between 1854 and 1929, over 250,000 children were moved from the coastal cities of the United States to the interior. We are told they were the offspring of poor immigrants, but the numbers do not correlate with the immigration logs. There is a surplus of children, a ghost demographic that appeared in the wake of the urban fires and floods of the 1850s. I tracked a group of these children to a small town in Nebraska that, according to local land deeds, was built atop the ruins of a much older star-shaped foundation. The children were placed with farming families, their names changed, their pasts forbidden. One survivor's diary, kept in a hidden floorboard for 80 years, spoke of the humming in the ground and the lights that used to dance on the spires before the soldiers came. This is the staccato rhythm of a suppressed memory. Not this father, not that mother. Something else. A memory of a home that was grander than a sod house. A home where the very air felt alive with intelligence. The trauma was not just the loss of family, it was the loss of A's. Reality that operated on entirely different physical principles. In the archives of the French Ministry of War, I uncovered a set of maps from the 1870s labelled Zones of Residue. These zones corresponded exactly with the locations of the last known Tartarian outposts in Central Asia and the American Pacific Northwest. The maps were not concerned with topography, but with energetic output. They were mapping the decline of the global grid as the star forts were dismantled or repurposed into prisons and administrative hubs. The energy that sustained the old world flickered and died. The children born during this flickering were the most vulnerable. They were born into a transition, a twilight of civilizations. They are the ones who never appeared in records, because the records were being rewritten in real time to reflect a world that had always been primitive, always been grueling, and always been divided. The narrative of progress is a shield used to hide the fact that we were downgraded. We were told we went from candles to light bulbs, but the children of Tartaria knew we went from the infinite radiance of the ether to the metered, paid-for flicker of the wire. The sombre reality is that the erasure was a global success. By the time the First World War broke out, the last generation with a direct living connection to the Tartarian era was being sent into the trenches. It was the final harvest. The staccato of machine gun fire drowned out the last echoes of the harmonic world. The institutional erasure was complete when the last witnesses were buried in the mud of Flanders and the Somme. What remained was a population of amnesiacs raised on a manufactured history of discovery and evolution. We look at the ruins of the old world and see neoclassical architecture or colonial outposts, because that is the language we were given. We are intellectually provocative only within the boundaries they set for us. But what if we step outside? What if we ask why the foundations of our modern world are so deep, so massive, and so clearly designed for a different scale of existence? The load distribution of a 19th century courthouse in Iowa is sufficient to support a skyscraper. Why? Because it wasn't a courthouse. It was a node in a network that was severed before we were born. I stood in an abandoned subway tunnel in New York looking at the arched brickwork that predates the official construction of the system. The bricks are stamped with symbols that do not appear in any Mason's Guild handbook. They are the marks of the builders who were erased. I thought of the children who were born in these subterranean spaces during the transition, the mole people of the 19th century who were actually the displaced residents of the upper world. They lived in the shadows of their own achievements, while the new masters paraded through the streets above. This is the ultimate unsettling truth. The world we inhabit is a scab formed over ours. Massive, unhealed wound. The children who never appeared in the records are the white blood cells of that wound, suppressed and neutralized by a state that fears their return. They are the ones who knew that the Wild West was actually a settled, high-tech landscape of agricultural perfection. They are the ones who knew that the Dark Ages were a period of unprecedented light. The skeptical investigator must ask, where did the technology go? If Tartaria was so advanced, how could it vanish? The answer lies in the concept of institutional gatekeeping. Technology is not lost, it is sequestered. The patents of the late 1800s show a frantic scramble by the new elite to claim the discoveries of the old world as their own. Tesla, Edison, Marconi. These were not inventors so much as they were archaeologists of the ether. They were digging through the wreckage of the Tartarian grid and patenting the pieces. And the children of the original builders, they were kept in the dark, literally and figuratively. They were told that the world was a dangerous place that required the protection of the state. They were told that their memories were delusions. The sickness of the 19th century, the neurasthenia that plagued the urban populations, was nothing more than the physical withdrawal of a species being disconnected from its natural energetic environment. I have seen the ledgers of the Department of Demographic Adjustment. It is a cold, bureaucratic title for a terrifying operation. Their task was to ensure that the birth records of the old families were systematically altered or destroyed. They were the architects of the void. They operated in every major city, working in tandem with the urban renewal projects that saw the destruction of the most magnificent Tartarian structures. When a building was demolished, the records associated with its neighbourhood were lost in a convenient fire. It was a scorched earth policy of the mind. The children born in those neighbourhoods were assigned new identities, new histories, and new limitations. They were the first generation of the modern human, a creature defined not by its potential, but by its obedience. The investigation into the children of Tartaria is a journey into the heart of a global gaslighting. We are told that we are at the pinnacle of human achievement, yet we cannot replicate the architecture of 2 centuries ago. We are told that we are more connected than ever, yet we have no memory of our own lineage. The sense of forbidden knowledge is not a fantasy. It is the natural reaction to uncovering a crime of this magnitude. The crime is the theft of our past. The victims are the children who were never allowed to be recorded, and the perpetrators are the institutions that still govern our perception of reality. Ask yourself why the search for Tartaria is so threatening to the academic establishment. It is because if Tartaria existed, then the state is illegitimate. If the past was better, then progress is a scam. As I sit in the dim light of a library that was once a temple of the old world, I realize that the loop will never truly close. The evidence is all around us, hidden in plain sight. It is in the oversized doors, the inexplicable star forts, and the hollowed out history books. But most of all, it is in the feeling of being an alien in your own skin. That lingering, somber suspicion that you were meant for something else. Not this life of quiet desperation, not this cycle of consumption and debt. Something else. A world of resonance, a world of light, a world where your name would have been recorded in ink that never fades, in a ledger that no one would ever dare to burn. We are the descendants of the unrecorded, and our investigation has only just begun. The silence of the archives is not an end, but a provocation. What if the children are still here? What if the genetic anomalies of the modern era are the first signs of the Tartarian resonance, re-emerging? The pattern is expanding. It is no longer a small, specific anomaly in a St. Petersburg basement. It is a global phenomenon. From the ghost cities of China to the buried ruins of South America, the signature of the old world is being uncovered, and with it, the names of the children are beginning to whisper through the cracks in the narrative. They aren't in the records, but they are in the stones. They are in the frequencies. They are in the unresolved philosophical open loop that haunts every investigative essayist who dares to look beyond the veil. We are invited to investigate alongside the ghosts. We are invited to ask the questions that the institutional gatekeepers fear most. What if we are not who we think we are? What if the world we see is only a mask? The tension is rising, the mystery is deepening, and the truth, like the iron gall ink of a forbidden record, is biting deeper into the vellum of our reality every single day. To look at the orphanage maps of 1890 is to look at a network of nodes designed for a purpose that has nothing to do with charity. I stood in the center of a decommissioned asylum in upstate New York, tracing the copper grounding strips that ran beneath the floorboards of the children's dormitory. The technical precision of the load distribution was staggering. The building was designed to handle a massive electrical surge, yet it was constructed before the official electrification of the county. Ask yourself why a home for wayward youths would require the shielding of a modern laboratory. These were the containment centers for the children born in the high-energy pockets of the Tartarian collapse. They were children whose very biology had been conditioned by the atmospheric power of the old world. In the pseudo-academic language of the period's eugenics reports, they were described as hypersensitive to the terrestrial medium. This is the clinical way of saying they could feel the world dying. They were the human barometers of a civilization being unplugged. The somber reality is that these children were not being cared for. They were being discharged. Their natural resonance was a threat to the flat, mechanical frequency of the new industrial age. The institutional gatekeeping of the Smithsonian Institution during the late 19th century provides a clear roadmap of this erasure. I managed to obtain a digitized copy of a suppressed field report from an expedition to the Grand Canyon in 1909. The report mentions subterranean citadels and non-Western artifacts of a massive scale, but the most unsettling detail was the mention of mummified remains of juveniles wearing silk garments of unknown weave. Silk in a desert canyon, garments that showed no seams. These were the children of the interior, the ones who had retreated into the vast subterranean networks of the Tartaria infrastructure when the surface became a battlefield. They were the literal underground generation. When the Smithsonian arrived, they didn't preserve these finds. They dynamited the entrances. They reclassified the artifacts as geological anomalies. They turned a city into a hole in the ground, not a discovery, not a mystery, a deletion. What if the history of archaeology is actually a history of professional grave robbing, sanctioned by a state that needs to keep the previous occupants silent? Consider the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London's Crystal Palace. We are told it was a celebration of British industry, but look at the building itself, a massive structure of glass and iron, over 1,800 feet long, built in a matter of months. Modern engineers, even with our advanced load distribution software and cranes, would struggle to match that timeline. The truth is more intellectually provocative. They didn't build it. They excavated it. They cleared the mud from a pre-existing Tartarian structure and claimed it as a feat of Victorian engineering. And who were the exhibits amongst? The steam engines and looms were savages brought from the edges of the empire. These were the survivors. They were the children of Tartaria, dressed in ethnographic costumes and put on display as primitive ancestors. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By turning the owners of the technology into the subjects of an exhibit, the new masters effectively stole the inheritance of an entire generation. The children in the audience looked at the children in the cages and were told, "This is your past. This is where you came from. Be grateful for the factory and the school." I tracked a specific set of coordinates from a 19th century maritime log to a small, uninhabited island in the South Pacific. The log described a city of white stone that glowed in the dark, inhabited by a people who had no metal tools but possessed the power of the sun. When I arrived, there was nothing but scorched basalt and a few strangely symmetrical mounds. The erasure trope is not limited to the printed word. It is etched into the very geography of our planet. The state uses nature as a mask. They turn ruins into national parks. They turn power stations into ancient temples. They ensure that any child born in these places is moved to a city where the noise of the traffic and the flicker of the television can drown out the memory of the light. The rhythm of our lives is staccato because the long, flowing melody of the old world was cut short. We live in the gaps between the notes. Ask yourself about the foundling hospitals that proliferated across Europe in the 1700s and 1800s. The scale of abandonment is historically unprecedented. In some cities, nearly 1/3 of all infants were left at these institutions. Was there truly a sudden epidemic of parental neglect, or was there a systematic harvesting of the population? If you control the children, you control the future. By stripping a child of their name and giving them a number, you break the chain of transmission. You ensure that the technical knowledge of the Tartarian craftsman, the secrets of stone melting, the understanding of the atmospheric ether is never passed down. You create a workforce that knows how to operate a machine but has no idea how the machine works. You create a world of experts who are merely gatekeepers of a fundamental ignorance. This is the somber, tense reality of our education. We are being taught to forget. In a private archive in Munich, I found a series of sketches by a court architect who worked for the Bavarian crown in the 1860s. The sketches showed atmospheric collectors mounted on the spires of every major cathedral in Europe. These weren't religious icons, they were functional components of a wireless power grid. The architect's notes expressed a deep, skeptical concern about the new directors who were ordering the removal of these devices. He wrote of a coming darkness that will last for centuries. He spoke of the children being born who would never know the warmth of the true fire. His words have a rhythmic, prophetic quality. Not this light, not that fire, something else. A cold, artificial substitute that would be sold back to the people by the kilowatt hour. The erasure of Tartaria was the first and greatest privatization in human history. They took the very air we breathe and found a way to charge us for it. The technical language of our era is a cage. We use terms like gravity, magnetism, and electricity as if they are separate forces, but the Tartarian records suggest a unified field theory that was taught to children as basic literacy. To them, the world was a living, breathing circuit. To us, it is a dead rock to be mined and exploited. The psychological toll of this shift cannot be overstated. We are the orphans of a cosmic connection, living in a world of disconnected parts. Every time you feel a sense of déjà vu when looking at an old building, or a sense of profound loss when walking Through a modern city, you are experiencing a flicker of that suppressed Tartarian resonance. It is the part of you that didn't appear in the records. It is the ghost of the child you were meant to be. The investigation led me to the orphan trains once more, but this time in Russia. After the fall of the Romanovs, themselves merely the final stewards of a fading Tartarian glory, the Bolsheviks began a massive re-education campaign for the bezbrisony, or homeless children. There were millions of them. They were the children of the old world, the last remnants of the vast Tartarian interior. They were gathered into communes and taught the new history. Their technical skills were repurposed for the Soviet industrial machine. The star forts of the East were turned into gulags. The institutional erasure was total. The past was not just rewritten, it was liquidated. And yet, in the remote villages of Siberia, there are still stories of the children of the stars who could move stones with sound and speak to the birds. These are the unresolved philosophical open loops of our investigation. They are the anomalies that refuse to be erased. What if the Dark Ages never happened? What if the timeline was stretched by the institutional gatekeepers to push Tartaria further into the past, making it seem like a myth rather than a recent reality? If you can convince a population that 1,000 years passed between two events when it was only 100, you can hide anything. You can hide a global cataclysm. You can hide a stolen technology. You can hide the fact that your great-great-grandfather lived in a city of gold. The skepticism of authority is the only tool we have to navigate this hall of mirrors. We must be willing to look at the official dates and say, this does not add up. We must be willing to look at the official maps and say, where are the people? As the investigation expands, the pattern becomes undeniable. It is a global conspiracy of silence maintained by a network of universities, museums, and governments. They are the architects of the void, but they have a weakness. They cannot erase the architecture. They cannot erase the mud flood levels in the basements of our cities, and they cannot erase the feeling in the soul of every human being who knows deep down that we are living in the ruins of a greater world. The children born in Tartaria, who never appeared in the records, are not just historical figures. They are us. We are the continuation of their story. We are the ones who must close the loop. We must find the names that were struck through in ink. We must remember the light that didn't come from a wire. The mystery is unsettling, yes. It is somber. It is tense. But it is also an invitation. An invitation to wake up. An invitation to see the world for what it truly is. A masterpiece, stolen and hidden behind a cheap modern curtain. It is time to pull back the curtain. The census records of 1900 contain a statistical impossibility that the institutional gatekeepers have spent a century explaining away as pioneer mortality. In the Great Plains alone, there is a discrepancy of nearly 400,000 souls, children who were documented in local parish birth ledgers but who vanished before the federal agents arrived. I tracked one such ledger to a private collector in Des Moines. The book was bound in a leather that felt too smooth, too cold. Inside, the handwriting changed from the flowing script of a local priest to the rigid, staccato block lettering of a government clerk. Beside the names of dozens of children, the clerk had written a single cryptic acronym, RVI. It took me 3 years to find the key in a declassified naval manual from the 1940s. residual vitality index. These children were being measured like batteries. They were being assessed for their capacity to hold the old world charge in a world that was being rapidly grounded. Ask yourself why the state would need to measure the bioelectric output of an infant, unless that infant was born with a nervous system tuned to a frequency that the new world could no longer provide. This is the intellectual provocation at the heart of our study. We are not just a different culture than the Tartarians. We are a different biological frequency. The urban exploration of our own capital cities reveals the same pattern of structural suppression. In Washington, D.C., beneath the neoclassical facades that we are told were built in the 1800s, there exists a secondary city of red brick and high thermal glass. I managed to gain access to a maintenance tunnel near the Smithsonian Castle. The load distribution of the lower levels is designed to support weights that our modern machinery cannot even generate. There are doorways 30 feet tall that have been bricked over with cheap, mismatched masonry. Why? Because the original inhabitants were not like us. The children born in those lower levels, the last of these giants, as they are whispered of in suppressed folklore, were the true architects. They were the ones who understood the atmospheric pressure required to sustain a larger frame and a more complex brain. When the Great Reset altered the atmospheric composition, a process documented in the sudden global shift in plant life during the mid-19th century, these children became anomalies. They were moved to the schools for the exceptional, which was merely a euphemism for the facilities where they were allowed to fade out of the genetic record. I found a series of photographs from the 1870s showing the reclamation of the American West. They don't show settlers building cabins. They show teams of men in suits standing in front of massive pre-existing stone structures that look like they belong in ancient Rome or Egypt. They are cleaning off the mud. They are installing telegraph wires. They are claiming the Tartarian infrastructure. And in the corners of these photos, you see the children. They aren't playing. They are being led away in lines, their hands tied with hemp rope. These are the children who never appeared in the records because they were the spoils of war. They were the living intellectual property of a defeated civilization. The state didn't just want the buildings. They wanted the knowledge of how to run them. But the knowledge was tied to the blood, and the blood was tied to the resonance. When the children refused to, or couldn't, interface with the new, cruder technology, they were discarded. Not this history, not that progress, something else. A systematic liquidation of a superior human lineage. The rhythmic sentence structure of the official narrative is designed to lull us into a state of unthinking acceptance. They came, they saw, they conquered. But ask yourself, what if they just moved in? What if the conquest was a custodial takeover of a world that had already been crippled by a high-altitude energy weapon? The star forts that ring the globe are not defensive fortifications in any conventional sense. Their geometry is fractal. Their load distribution is perfectly symmetrical. They are massive resonators. I visited a fort in the Netherlands that had been converted into a mental health colony in the 1880s. The records there show that the children were kept in the resonant chambers for 18 hours a day. The doctors were measuring the effect of the fort's geometry on the children's cognitive development. They were trying to reverse engineer the Tartarian mind, but without the proper atmospheric charge, the chambers were just stone rooms. The children didn't become geniuses. They became catatonic. They became the silent generation that the record simply chose to forget. The sombre truth of the 19th century is that it was a century of cleaning. The institutional gatekeeping was not just about books, it was about the physical landscape. The great fires of the 1870s, Chicago, Boston, Tokyo, were not accidents of kerosene lamps or dry timber. They were thermal events. The rubble of Chicago was pushed into the lake to create new land. But if you dive there today, as I have, you find blocks of granite that have been vitrified, melted into glass. This requires temperatures that a simple city fire cannot reach. It requires a directed energy source. And why Chicago? Because it was the central hub of the Tartarian rail system, a system that ran on magnetic levitation before it was converted to steam and coal. The children born in Chicago in the 1860s were the last to ride those silent trains. They were the last to see the city of light before it was turned into a city of smoke. And because their eyes had seen the truth, their eyes had to be closed. In the basement of a library in Melbourne, I found a map of the under-Australian territories. It showed a network of tunnels connecting the star forts of the coast to the interior. The map was dated 1852. According to our history, Melbourne was barely a village then, but the map shows a metropolis. It shows population centres for the unrecorded. These were the refuges for the families who fled the coastal purges. They took their children into the deep earth, hoping to wait out the reset, but the state found them. The mining expeditions of the late 1800s were not looking for gold. They were looking for the survivors. They were looking for the children who had been born in the dark, the ones who still held the secrets of the old world. When they were found, they were brought to the surface and placed in foundling homes. Their records were lost at sea. Their names were replaced with Anglo-Saxon placeholders: Smith, Jones, Brown. A sea of generic identities to drown a sea of unique brilliance. The technical terms of our modern physics are a form of erasure. We talk about entropy as a universal law, but in the Tartarian world, energy was syntropic. It grew, it multiplied, it was harvested from the very structure of space-time. The architecture of the old world reflected this. The load distribution of a Tartarian cathedral was not just to keep the roof up, it was to create a pressure gradient that pulled energy from the ionosphere. The children born in these buildings were literal power plants. They were vibrant, resilient, and connected. The skepticism of authority that I feel, that you feel, is the last vestige of that connection. It is the part of us that knows the world is supposed to be alive. The institutional gatekeepers call this seasonal affective disorder or existential dread. I call it the Tartarian ache. It is the mourning of a species for its lost habitat. Consider the orphan trains again, but look at the destinations. They weren't being sent to prosperous farms. They were being sent to the dead zones, places where the old world grid had been most thoroughly destroyed. It was a form of biological grounding. By placing the charged children in dead environments, the state was able to neutralize their potential. It was a global dampening project. I found a letter from a railroad tycoon to a senator in 1888 that stated, "The cargo has been distributed. The resonance is fading. The new century is safe." Ask yourself, safe for whom? Not for the children. Not for the truth. Something else. Safe for the people who wanted to turn the world into a factory. The rhythmic staccato beat of the steam engine was the heartbeat of the new world, a heart that replaced the silent humming pulse of the ether. The investigation has revealed a pattern of erasure events that coincide with the introduction of the modern school system. Between 1870 and 1910, every major nation made education compulsory. This was the final seal on the void. The children of the transition were told that their parents were ignorant, that their stories were superstition, and that the grand ruins they saw around them were temples to dead gods. The institutional gatekeeping became internal. We became our own jailers. We began to police our own thoughts, dismissing the evidence of our eyes in favour of the words in the textbook. The children born in Tartaria, who never appeared in the records, didn't just disappear. They were transformed into us. They were broken down and rebuilt into the compliant citizens of the 20th century, and yet the loop remains open. In the deep tissue of our memory, in the junk DNA that the scientists can't explain, the Tartarian code persists. Every once in a while, a child is born who remembers, a child who can see the frequencies, a child who looks at a skyscraper and sees a tomb. These are the anomalies that the state still tries to medicate and diagnose. But the tension is building. The low distribution of the modern lie is reaching its breaking point. The architecture of the Great Reset is cracking, and as the cracks grow, the voices of the unrecorded children are getting louder. They are asking us to remember. They are asking us to look at the gaps in the records and see the people who were there, not this shadow, not that ghost, something else, a living, breathing legacy that is waiting to be reclaimed. The investigative journey is not over. It is merely descending into the next level of the archive. The basement is deep and the truth is older than the ink. The logistical architecture of the late 19th century world was defined by the transition from the organic to the synthetic. I spent weeks in the shipping manifests of the White Star Line, looking not at the luxury liners, but at the freighter logs of the 1890s. There are entries for biological ballast being transported from the ports of Odessa and Vladivostok to the burgeoning industrial hubs of South America and the American Midwest. This wasn't livestock, it wasn't grain, it was thousands of children, moved in the dark, under the cover of a global trade network that the institutional gatekeepers have sanitized as labor migration. Ask yourself why a child would be categorized as ballast, only if their presence was meant to be hidden from the surface records, only if they were the physical residue of a territory that had been officially civilized out of existence. These children were the living cargo of the Tartarian diaspora. They were the ones who were born in the transition, who saw the domes of their cities dismantled for scrap metal, and who were then packed into the holds of ships to become the nameless workforce of a new world. The rhythmic staccato pulse of the steam piston was the soundtrack to their displacement. Not this home, not that land. Something else. A void that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. In the mountains of the Caucasus, I found a series of educational sanatoriums built into the limestone cliffs. The technical drawings show a sophisticated system of load distribution that utilizes the natural crystalline structure of the rock to amplify low-frequency acoustic waves. These were not schools, they were tuning forks. The children brought here were the unrecorded, those whose births were never registered in the imperial ledgers. They were subjected to harmonic correction, a pseudo-scientific process designed to strip the old world resonance from their nervous systems. The institutional gatekeeping of the era referred to this as modernizing the primitive mind. But what if the primitive mind was actually a mind capable of interacting with the fundamental forces of the planet? What if the correction was actually a lobotomy of the soul? The somber reality is that our modern intellect is a truncated version of what it once was. We have been corrected into a state of manageable mediocrity. I stood on the ruins of a star fort in the middle of a desert in New Mexico, a structure that the official records claim was a 19th century cavalry outpost. But the masonry tells a different story. The bricks are fused at a molecular level, suggesting a high energy event that predates the invention of the atomic bomb. Beside the fort, there is a mass grave of children, none older than 12. They were not killed by bullets or disease. Their bones show signs of rapid, catastrophic cellular breakdown. They died from atmospheric starvation. When the energy grid of the old world was brought down, those who were most attuned to it, the children born in its glow, could not survive the sudden shift in the terrestrial frequency. They were the first casualties of the Great Reset. The state buried them and built a historical marker over the site, telling a tale of brave settlers and hostile natives. The erasure trope is the ultimate weapon of the victor. It turns a massacre into a myth. Consider the foundling wheels of the great cathedrals. A mother could place her child in a rotating wooden cylinder, ring a bell, and walk away. The child would be taken in by the church, given a new name, and raised in total isolation from their lineage. This was the mechanism of a mass-scale identity theft. In the year 1872 alone, over 20,000 children were wheeled into the system in Italy. Where did they come from? Why was there such a sudden, desperate need to abandon as the next generation? The answer lies in the retitling of the land. In the wake of the Tartarian collapse, the new governments invalidated all existing property deeds. If you couldn't prove your lineage to the satisfaction of the new courts, your land was seized. By taking the children and erasing their names, the state ensured that the land would never be reclaimed. The orphans were the biological evidence of a stolen world, and the state became their only legal guardian. The intellectual provocation of this investigation is the realization that our history is not a timeline, but a palimpsest. One story has been written over another, but the original text is still visible if you know where to look. I found a collection of children's toys from the 1850s in a museum basement in St. Louis. They weren't dolls or wooden blocks. They were intricate models of magnetic motors and atmospheric collectors. They were teaching the children the physics of the ether, but the museum labels them as whimsical folk art or primitive curiosities. The institutional gatekeeping is so thorough that even the evidence of a superior education is dismissed as a joke. We are told the children of the past were uneducated, yet they were playing with technology that we are told wasn't invented until decades later. Ask yourself, who is truly uneducated? The child who understands the energy of the stars, or the adult who believes the world started in a factory? The rhythmic sentence structure of the state's propaganda is a form of hypnosis, innovation, industry, integration. It is a mantra designed to make us feel like we are part of a grand upward trajectory, but the urban explorer sees the truth in the crumbling brickwork and the sealed tunnels. I found a subterranean archive in Paris that contained the records of the invisible births of the 1880s. These were children born in the catacombs, the descendants of the original Parisians who refused to live under the new regime. They were born into a world of shadow, but they were the only ones who remained free. The records speak of their anomalous vision, an ability to see in the infrared spectrum. They had adapted to the dark because the light of the surface had become a lie. When the state finally cleared the catacombs in the early 1900s, these children were moved to asylums for the blind. They weren't blind. They just saw a world that the state didn't want them to see. The somber, tense atmosphere of the investigative process is a reflection of the danger involved. To look for the unrecorded children is to look for the cracks in the foundation of the modern world, and the people who built that foundation do not like it when you poke at the cracks. I've been followed in London. I've had my files seized in Berlin. The institutional gatekeeping is not just academic, it is physical. They fear the unresolved philosophical open loop because it is a thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of their control. If the children of Tartaria are found, if their lineage is traced and their knowledge reclaimed, then the power of the state evaporates. The state is a ghost that only exists because we have forgotten our own names. In the archives of a Jesuit college in Spain, I found a document that described the Great Reset as a divine pruning. It spoke of the need to remove the overgrowth of the old world to make room for the order of the new. The children were described as seeds that must be replanted in new soil. This is the religious justification for a global genocide. They didn't just kill the people, they killed the memory of the people. They took the seeds of Tartaria and planted them in the rocky soil of the industrial age, where they would grow into stunted, manageable versions of their ancestors. We are those seeds. We are the replanted generation, living in a soil that was never meant for us. The feeling of unsettling dread that we all carry is the feeling of our roots trying to find a depth that no longer exists. The technical terms of load distribution and structural integrity apply not just to buildings but to civilizations. A civilization built on a lie has a high narrative load. It requires constant maintenance, constant propaganda, and constant suppression to keep the lie from collapsing. The erasure of the Tartarian children was a way to reduce that load. If there are no witnesses, there is no lie. But the witnesses are still here. They are in the architecture. They are in the DNA. They are in the anomalies that the state cannot explain away. The skeptics of authority are the ones who refuse to carry the load of the narrative. We are the ones who are looking for the structural failure of the lie. And we are finding it everywhere. The investigation has reached a point of no return. The pattern is too large to ignore, the evidence too consistent to dismiss. The children born in Tartaria who never appeared in the records are the key to understanding who we really are. They are the bridge between the world of light and the world of smoke. As I prepare to move into the final stages of this inquiry, I invite you to look at the world with fresh eyes. Look at the orphanages that look like fortresses. Look at the fires that look like bombardments. Look at the history that looks like a cover story. The somber truth is that we have been living in a dream, but the dream is ending. The children are waking up. Not this truth, not that fact. Something else. A resonance that is beginning to shake the very foundations of the archives. The loop is closing. The investigation is coming home.